Hello everyone, my name is Ashna Yadav. I am a student of Kendriya Vidyalaya HEBBAL, and today I am here to present a module on liberalization, privatization and globalization under the guidance of Mrs. T. M. SUSHMA ma'am, who is a PGT economics teacher at Kendriya Vidyalaya HEBBAL. Before I started reading this chapter, I had many questions in my mind, and I know you would have it too. We got independence in the year 1947, whereas LPG was introduced under the new economic policy of 1991. Certainly, there would be some factors which led to its introduction. Now, what were these factors? Why there was a need to introduce LPG in the year 1991? Did it actually mean fruitful, or did it worsen the situation? Now all these queries will be answered later in this chapter once we complete it, and I assure you, you will be able to answer every question pertaining to this chapter. So now let's get started. After independence, India followed mixed economic system, but in reality it was not so. The public sector overpowered the private sector. It established rigid rules and laws which actually hampered the growth and development of the country. And in order to stop it, there was a requirement of economic reforms. So economic reforms refer to the set of economic policies which are directed to accelerate the pace of growth and development. Definitely, there cannot be one reason for the economic reforms. There were many. Now let's discuss them one by one. So the first one is poor performance of public sector. As I discussed earlier, public sector had actually overpowered the private sector, which means there was no competition, and due to lack of fear, there was no improvement in the condition. So except for a few industries, the public sector actually was not performing very well, and the result was disappointing. So the second reason for the need of reform was deficit in balance of payments. Now deficit in balance of payment arises when the foreign payments from the imports are actually higher than the foreign receipts from exports. Now this happened because we didn't have good manufacturing units, we didn't have good machineries, and as a result we produced very low quality goods which were highly priced in the foreign market. So this led to a slow growth of exports. But on the contrary, our country was highly dependent upon the imports from the foreign countries. So the third reason was inflationary pressures. Now we all are aware that inflation refers to the rise in the general price level, and this happened due to increase in the money supply and shortage of essential goods. The next reason being fall in the foreign exchange reserves. Now forex reserves are basically the external assets which are held by the central bank for direct financing of external payments, such as the foreign currencies, gold, drawing rights, etc. Now, after a good accumulation from the past years, in 1991, finally the foreign exchange reserves fell to their lowest level, which created a foreign exchange crisis in the country. They declined to such a level that it was impossible for our country to finance the imports for more than 2 weeks, or to even pay the interest that had to be paid to international lenders. Due to such situation, no other country or international funder was willing to lend to India. Another big reason was the huge burden of debts which the country had created for itself because of the more amount of expenditures than the revenue. Another reason was inefficient management. The government had to actually generate surplus revenue to meet the challenges of our country like unemployment, poverty, population explosion, etc. But the government expenditure actually began to exceed than the revenue. So it had to borrow from other countries and international financial institutions, and due to which it actually went into a debt trap, and there was no attention which was given to boost exports to pay for the growing imports. So due to the lack of efficient management, there was a need for the reforms. So in order to manage the economic crisis of 1991, the then Indian Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, along with the Indian government, approached for loan from the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, very popularly known as the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. India availed of $7 billion loan from these agencies as loan. Hence, the new economic policy can be broadly classified into two kinds: stabilization and structural reforms. Now, stabilization measures were short-term measures for which the loan was taken from IMF, and the structural reforms were the measures of the long terms for which the loan was taken from the World Bank. So the very first reform after the 1991 policy was liberalization. Now it means removal of the entry and growth restrictions on the private sector. So we all are aware that the public sector initially overpowered the private sector, and it contained rigid laws and rules due to which the private sector could not actually establish its roots in the country, which actually hampered the growth of the country than any good. So liberalization was needed, and under this, business is freely allowed to run on the commercial lines, whether it's public or whether it's private. But more importance was given to the private industries by removing the restrictions upon them which were imposed initially by the public sectors. And liberalization was actually required because it will tend to create much more competition into the economy, which will create a sense of fear in the public as well as the private sectors, and they will always tend to perform better as compared to the other, and this will actually help in the development of the country. So under the economic reforms of liberalization, the very first reform that we would discuss is industrial reform. Under this, there was reduction in the industrial licensing. That means any industry could come up with new units or expand or diversify the existing line of manufacture without any license, except for the 5 industries that were held on account of environmental, safety and strategic considerations. The other one is decrease in role of public sector. Now, under the new economic policy, the number of industries reserved for the public sector was reduced from 17 to just 3, namely atomic energy, railways and defense equipments. That means except these 3 industries, all the industries will be governed by the private sectors rather than public sector. The other one was de-reservation under the small scale industries. That means in many industries, the market was allowed to actually calculate or determine the prices through the market forces of demand and supply, and not by any directive policy of the government. So now we move on to the financial sector reforms. So in India, the financial sector is controlled by the Reserve Bank of India, which is the Central Bank of India. It is also known as the apex body. It develops or decides the amount of money that the banks can keep with themselves, or fixes the interest rate and nature of lending to various sectors. Under the financial sector reforms, the role of RBI was reduced from regulator to facilitator of financial sector. That means the financial sector was allowed to take decisions on many matters without consulting the RBI. The other one is origin of private banks. The reforms policies led to the establishment of private sector banks, Indian as well as foreign. That for instance, let's say Indian banks like ICICI and foreign banks like HSBC increased the competition and benefited the consumers through lower interest rates and better services. There was also increase in the limit of foreign investment up to around 74%, and the foreign institutional investors such as the merchant bankers, the pension funds, the mutual funds, they were now allowed to invest in Indian financial markets. So now we move on to the tax reforms. So tax reform basically mean the government's taxation policies, which are collectively known as the fiscal policies. Now taxes are basically of 2 types, direct taxes and indirect taxes. Direct taxes refers to the taxes which are charged on the incomes of individuals as well as the profits of the business enterprises, and indirect taxes refers to the taxes which the consumer pays on the consumption of the goods or services. The major tax reforms include the rationalization of the direct taxes and the reforms in the indirect taxes, along with the simplified procedures on the part of taxpayers. Under the foreign exchange reforms, devaluation of rupee was done. So devaluation basically refers to the deliberate reduction in the value of the domestic country vis-a-vis any foreign currency by the government of a country. Now this was done in order to increase the inflow of the foreign exchange. And also the government of India let the market forces of demand and supply determine the exchange value of the Indian rupee in terms of the foreign currency. Before 1991, a lot of restrictions were imposed on the imports as well in order to protect the domestic industry, but it reduced the efficiency and competitiveness of the domestic industries, and it led to their slow growth. So the reforms in the trade and investment policies were initiated to increase the international competition, to promote the foreign investments and technology into the economy, and to promote efficiency of local industries and adoption of modern technologies. So the reforms which included here was the removal of quantitative restrictions on the imports and exports. Furthermore, the export duties were removed so that it increases the competitive position of the Indian goods in the international markets. Also, the import duties were considerably reduced, which improved the competitiveness of the domestic products. However, the import licensing was abolished, but it was kept for hazardous and environmentally sensitive industries. This not only encouraged the domestic industries to import raw materials at better prices, but also raised their efficiency and made them more competitive. So we conclude that with the introduction of liberalization policy, the licensing system was abolished. So now we move on to the next topic, which is privatization. So privatization is basically the transfer of ownership, management and control of the public sector enterprises to the entrepreneurs in the private sector. In short, the transfer of ownership from the public sector to the private sector. And please make a detailed note of this, that when public sector undertaking is transferring the ownership, management and control to the private sector, then only privatization takes place, and it's not vice versa. Privatization accepts the private enterprises to work in a competitive environment both domestically as well as internationally. This pushes the industries to perform better than before. It promotes diversification and expansion of the production. It promotes consumer sovereignty. That means that it gives the consumers wider choices and better quality of life, because today's consumer is a quality conscious and he demands value for money. Now, as we say that there are always two sides to a coin, here as well we find losses due to privatization. So that can be said that the goods are produced only for those who have the means to buy them. That means the weaker sections of the society suffer deprivation because they cannot buy them. They are almost or nearly, we can say, they are very highly priced. So we can conclude that due to privatization, private industries started establishing their roots in our country. So now we move on to the next topic, which is globalization. So globalization basically means integrating the national economy with the world economy through removal of barriers on international trade and capital movements. So we can also say that it's like a window to the outside world through which we can interact beyond our domestic boundaries. It was done to create a borderless world and make the global markets more flexible, so that a person sitting in India can provide services to a person sitting in America without any problem or without any issue faced by that person. It is a complex phenomenon as it aims to transform the world towards greater interdependence and integration. It involves creation of networks, exchanging of culture, exchanging of thinkings of different people towards other countries, etc. Just like other things, even globalization has positives and negatives. Now let's discuss the positives first in the globalization. So globalization resulted in greater access to the global market. Any person sitting in any part of the country can actually access the goods and services of any country. Then it also led to advanced technology. Now if a country has a good technology, then the other countries can get inspired from it and can also implement it into their country. Another one is better future prospects. So the developing countries can take inspiration from the developed countries and can actually try to become an important players in the international market. And the last one is better prospect for the skilled people across the globe, so that it will help them increase their earning by utilizing their skills worldwide. Now we'll talk about the cons of globalization. So it happens that the globalization accrue more to developed countries as they are able to explore and expand their markets in other countries. So developing countries get less chances as compared to the developed countries. And it also sometimes compromises the welfare and identity of the people belonging to the poor countries, and it almost or most of the time it increases the economic disparities among the nations and the people, and it has also made the MNCs gain the strong position in the developing countries than the domestic companies. So because of which the domestic companies face difficulties and they face stiff competition and are not able to establish their roots in any part of the country. So we can conclude that with the introduction of globalization, all the tariffs and quotas were removed from the trade, which were impacting and which were causing a hurdle on the growth of our economy. Now, after the implementation of new economic policy in 1991, there were many changes which were observed in our economy. Definitely positive changes, and one such change was outsourcing. Now, outsourcing refers to contracting out some of its activities to a third party, which were earlier performed by the organization. And these services include legal advices, computer services, advertisement, marketing, security, etc. So what used to happen was that the host company will give the work which is of not so importance to the person who is an expert in that particular field, and the managers or the host company will try to concentrate on those areas where their presence is actually required, and without their presence the work cannot be done. So they will try to concentrate on the very important aspects, and the remaining ones they will outsource it to the persons who are either experts in that field or who can actually perform the task for the managers. India has become a favorable destination of outsourcing for most of the MNCs because of availability of skilled manpower in India. Besides the skilled manpower, it also has cheap labor. The government policies are favorable to the MNCs as they get various offers such as tax concessions, tax holidays, etc. Another great reason is considerable growth of Indian IT industry, which has proved its competitive strength in the world. But on the contrary, developed countries oppose outsourcing to India. This is because outsourcing leads to outflow of funds from the developed countries to India, which reduces the income disparities between the two countries. Outsourcing also reduces the employment generation, and it creates job insecurity in the developed countries. So now we move on to our next topic, which is World Trade Organization. Now, World Trade Organization, also known as WTO, is an intergovernmental organization that is concerned with the regulation of international trade between the nations. At present, there are 164 member countries which are part of WTO. So prior to WTO, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, also known as GATT, was established as a global trade organization in the year 1948 with 23 countries. Now, when GATT was set up, it was set up to administer all the multilateral trade agreements by providing equal opportunities to all the countries in the international market. WTO was founded as the successor of GATT in the year 1995. India has kept its commitments made to the WTO. India has taken reasonable steps to liberalize trade by removing quantitative restrictions on the imports and reducing the tariff rates. The WTO agreements cover the trade in goods as well as services. It is to facilitate international trade. At present, as I said earlier, there are 164 member countries, and all are required to abide by the laws and policies framed under WTO rules. So what are the major functions which are performed by WTO? First one being to facilitate international trade by the removal of tariff as well as non-tariff barriers. Another is to establish a rule-based trading regime in which nations cannot place arbitrary restrictions on the trade. Third one is to enlarge the production and the trade of services between the countries. Fourth one, to ensure optimum utilization of the world resources and to protect the environment. Apart from this, the scholars believe that India as a developing country should not be a part of WTO. They think that major volumes of international trade occurs among the developed nations. As a result, the developing countries are being cheated as they are allowed to and even forced to open up their markets for the developed countries but are not allowed to access to the markets of the developed countries. So now we move on to the next topic, which is demonetization. India has seen 3 phases of demonetization till now. First in the year 1946, 7 in 1978, and third on 8 November 2016. So the very recent demonetization phase, it was decided by the Indian government to demonetize the high value currency notes of the denomination of rupees 500 and rupees 1000, ceasing to be legal tender. That means from here we can understand that demonetization is the act of removing a currency unit of its status as legal tender. That means that these currency notes are fiat money, but they are ceased to be legal tender. Main aim of demonetization was to curb corruption. So this was possible because there were many restrictions which were placed on the convertibility of the domestic money and bank deposits. So this would have helped the government to accumulate the black money generated by the income that has not been declared to the tax authorities. Now, after demonetization, the cash holdings arising from the declared income was readily deposited in banks and exchanged for new notes. However, the people holding the black money had to declare their unaccounted wealth and pay taxes at a penalty rate. So that means we can conclude that demonetization is viewed as a tax administrative measure. Also, it was a warning signal to the black marketers that tax evasion now will no longer be tolerated or accepted. Apart from channelizing savings into the formal financial system, demonetization was also viewed as to create a cashless economy, basically to depend upon digital transactions more in the upcoming years. So this was all about demonetization. Now we move on to GST. So GST is basically a comprehensive indirect tax which has replaced the various indirect taxes in India. So it was introduced by the government on the credo of one nation and one tax. It was passed in the parliament on March 2017, but it came into effect from 1st July 2017 onwards. It is a comprehensive multi-stage destination based tax that is levied on every value addition. As I said that it is a consumption based tax, that means a person who is a consumer of the goods or services has to pay the GST on it, whereas the producer need not. It not only reduces the burden by eliminating the tax on tax, which is cascading of taxes, but also improves the tax administration by mitigating the tax evasion, broadening the organized segment of the economy, and boosting the tax revenues. GST alone has replaced 17 indirect taxes, for instance, value added tax, service tax, excise duty, sales tax, etc. So this eliminates the need for filing the multiple returns and assessments. So how does this happen? So GST is basically charged at each stage of value addition, and the supplier offsets the levy on the inputs in the previous stages of value chain through the tax credit mechanism. Now the last dealer in the supply chain passes on the added GST to the consumer, making GST a destination based consumption tax. This does not mean that the consumers are at loss. The provision of availing input credit at each stage of value chain helps in avoiding the cascading effect under the GST, which is expected to reduce the prices of commodities and in turn benefit the consumers. So now we move on to the types of taxes under GST. There are basically three types: CGST, SGST and IGST. CGST is basically Central Goods and Service Tax, which is levied on the intra-state supply of goods or services by the center. SGST is State Goods and Service Tax, which is levied on the intra-state supply of goods and services by the state, including the UTs and within the legislature. And IGST is basically Integrated Goods and Service Tax, which is levied on the interstate supply of goods or services and is collected by the center. It is equivalent to the sum total of CGST and SGST. So what are the benefits of GST? It has proved to be a reduction in the overall tax burden because it has removed the cascading of taxes. So people now have to pay comparatively lesser amount of tax in the form of GST. There are no hidden taxes because GST works on the credo of one nation, one tax. It has also provided the mechanism of matching of invoices. That means input tax credit of the purchased services and goods will be available only when the inward supply details filed in by the buyer matches the outward supply details filed in by the supplier. It will also be a means of creating more employment opportunities for the people. Now all this is understandable, but what exactly is input tax credit? Well, input tax credit is basically reduction in the taxes paid on the inputs from the taxes to be paid on the output. Confusing, right? Let me explain. Okay, let's say that you have purchased certain raw material for rupees 10,000 and you are paying 18% GST on it, which is 1,800. Now you convert the raw material into the finished good, which is and you sell this to a consumer for rupees 15,000. Now the consumer has to pay 18% GST on it, which is 2,700. Now the net payable GST from your side is only rupees 900, which is 2,700 minus 1,800, because the ultimate burden of that GST will lie upon the consumer, because he is the ultimate person who is consuming the good or the service, and not the producer. So now we arrive at the last part of this chapter, which is discussing the merits and demerits of NEP. So let's first discuss the merits. Now we have seen an increase in the rate of economic growth. So the growth in the GDP was 5.6% during the 1980 to 91, as compared to the growth rate of 6.7% in the year 2017 to 18. So we can also see that in the first quarter of 2022 to 23, the GDP growth has recorded at an impressive rate of 13.5%. Now, during the reform period, the growth of agriculture has declined, but in the industrial sector, it reported certain fluctuations, whereas the growth of service sector has gone up. This indicates that the major growth is mainly driven by the growth in the service sector. So, the opening up of the economy has led to the rapid increase in the foreign direct investment, and the foreign investment increased from about $100 million to $30 billion in 2017 to 18. There has also been an increase in the foreign exchange reserves from about $6 billion to $550.14 billion. So India is one of the largest foreign exchange reserve holders in the world. There has been a rise in the exports, and there has been a proper control on the inflation. The inflation has actually reduced from the peak level of 17% to around 6.7% in the year 2022 to 23. And how can we forget the increase in the role of private sector? So the abolition of the licensing system has actually removed the restrictions on the entry of the private sectors, and now the public sector is not overpowering the private sector. In spite of so many merits, there have been some demerits too. Let's discuss them now. So the growing unemployment is one of the major factor. So the GDP growth rate has increased in the reform period, but such growth failed to generate sufficient employment opportunities in the country. And as I said earlier, that after the reforms there has been a decline in the agriculture sector. This was because there was reduction of public investments into it. There were subsidies which were removed, and this increased the cost of production, which adversely affected the small and marginal farmers. So as a result, there was a neglect of agriculture. There was also low level of industrial growth, because some of the imported goods were cheaper than our own country's products or services. So people shifted towards buying the imported goods than the domesticated goods, and there was lack of infrastructure facilities, including the power supply, because they remained inadequate due to lack of investments. Then there was ineffective disinvestment policy. There were failures because the assets of the public sector undertakings were undervalued and they were sold to the private sector. Moreover, such proceeds from the disinvestment were used to compensate the shortage of government revenues rather than using it for the development of public sector undertakings. Policies were also ineffective because the tax reduction in the reform period was done in order to generate larger revenue and to curb the tax evasion, but it did not result in increase in the tax revenue for the government. We are towards the end of this chapter, and we will end this video with the discussion of assertion and reasoning based questions, which are somewhat confusing to most of us. So when we discuss the assertion and reasoning, we would be summarizing the whole chapter and it will add to our understanding. So let's move on to the assertion and reasoning part. Firstly, we'll discuss how to go about these types of questions. Now, when assertion and reason is given, assertion is basically a statement, and reason, as the name suggests, is the reason. Now, when we think that both the statement and the reason are true, and reason is the correct explanation of the assertion, then we take the option A, which is both assertion and reason are true, and reason R is the correct explanation of assertion. But when we think that the statement is correct and the reason is also correct, but the reason is not the correct explanation of A, then we move on to the B option, which is both assertion and reason are true, but reason is not the correct explanation of A. Now when we think that assertion is true but reason is false, then we move on to the C option, and when we think that assertion is false but the reason is true, then we tick the D option. So I hope you are able to understand this. Now let's discuss this question. So the assertion says that there was a significant need to introduce a policy measure which could improve the efficiency and productivity in an economy. Yes, it is true. As we discussed in the very beginning of this chapter, that there were so many problems which needed to be solved, and there was a need for such a policy which could improve the efficiency. So that means assertion is true. Now let's move on to the reason. As a result, LPG model of growth was introduced in 1991, which provided a structural shift in the policy perspective of Indian economy. Very true. That means reason is also true. Why? Because we discussed this also, that in the year 1991, new economic policies, which was liberalization, privatization and globalization, was introduced. That means A is also true, R is also true, and R is the correct explanation of A. So we will tick the option A, that both assertion and reason are true, and reason is the correct explanation of assertion. So the next assertion says, every year government fixes a target for disinvestment of public sector enterprises. Do you think this is correct? Well, we discussed earlier that disinvestment is basically the transfer of the shareholding of a public sector to a private sector. Basically, the liquidation of assets of the government. So is this assertion true? Yes, it is absolutely true. So why does the government do this? Well, to generate revenue. Now let's move on to the reason. Reason says that disinvestment is an excellent tool for discarding the loss incurring public sector enterprises. Well, we studied this earlier, that if any public sector enterprise is incurring losses and is no longer profitable to the government, then they will tend to use the tool of disinvestment over here. That's the reason they will fix a target for disinvestment of the public sector enterprises every year. There is a link between the assertion and reason, so we can say that assertion and reason both are true, and reason is the correct explanation of assertion. So we can say that option A is again correct in this question. And it would not be an exaggeration if I say that our whole class answered this question correctly when Mrs. SUSHMA ma'am asked us this question. Now let's move on to the third question. So the next assertion says, there has been a structural shift in the role of RBI from regulator to facilitator of the financial sector. When we were studying the liberalization policy, under the financial reforms, we have studied this point that RBI became a facilitator of the financial sector from a regulator. That means this statement is absolutely true. Now we move on to the reason, which says financial sector has to consult RBI before taking any decision. Do you remember any point we discussed like this? Well, no. Financial sector need not consult RBI before taking any decision. Financial sector can take their own decisions under the guidelines mentioned by the RBI. They need not have to consult RBI every time before taking any decision. So our reason is false. So our correct answer regarding this question will be option number C, which says assertion is true but reason is false. Now we move on to next question. Assertion says selling of part of an equity of the public sector undertaking is called disinvestment. True, we discussed it some time back. Reason says the main reason for disinvestment is to keep all the operational units of the country under the private sector. Do you think this reason is appropriate? Well, we discussed it earlier that the main purpose is to generate revenue which will be utilized for the development of the country. So the reason is absolutely false. So here again the correct option is option number C. Now we move on to the final question, where the assertion says agriculture sector experienced an increase in growth during the reform period. How many of you think that this assertion is true? And how many of you think that this assertion is false? Well, let me remind you, when we were discussing about those who were against the NEP policies, we discussed a point that agriculture sector experienced a downfall during the reform period or after the NEP policy. This was because the industries were starting to set up and they experienced certain growth, but there were fluctuations in it. But the sector which experienced an increase in growth was the service sector and not the agriculture sector. So assertion is absolutely false, and when the assertion is false, there is no need to look at any other option or even the reason, because the correct option over here would always be the option which says assertion is false but reason is true. At last, I would like to thank Sushma ma'am for her guidance and constant support to make us understand the intricacies of this chapter. Thank you very much.